talking for some time about the 4-year study that we went through, all the way through the Bible chronologically, and now we've just backed up and we're looking at it again. It is a review of reminding ourselves again of how the things that we see through the Old Testament connect directly to Christ. We're going to see a couple of things here this morning. I wanted to share, I meant to do this Wednesday night. I know those are really small. And for those in the back, you might not be able to read all of that. That is the genealogy. That's the timeline, the genealogy of all of those that came, starting at Adam. And those are just simply using the years, the time that is given in Scripture. And so the time that each one, how long each one lived, and then how old each one was when they had a son that was born. And so it goes all the way through I've got this one going through Joseph. I took a lot of this from Brad Harrah, who's going to be here in just a couple of weeks. He has a chart in his book, Convicted, that's very similar to this. But there's some interesting things as we begin. You notice Abraham is all the way down here now. We are 20 generations in at this point. And but here's some interesting things a lot of people don't think about. I think I've used this before. But all of those, you have Adam, who lived to be 930 years old. And that line that goes through that timeline, all of the patriarchs before that line would have been able to have a personal face-to-face, one-on-one conversation with Adam. Which means Lamech, who is the father of Noah, could have talked to Adam about what it was like in the Garden of Eden. And so it's an amazing thought to think that all those generations, but because of the length of their lives, you've got Adam and Noah's father able to have a conversation. But then we also have the flood. The flood beginning according to the years that are given in the genealogy account there in Genesis. The flood would have been 1656 years after
creation, after Adam was created, which just happens to be the same year that Methuselah died. And so there's the debate of, did he die in the flood? It pretty much it's quite a coincidence that he died in the same year as the flood. So that says possibly a lot about the family even of Noah. That would have been, Methuselah would have been Noah's grandfather. That does not, now Lamech, his father, died 5 years before that. So he died 5 years before the flood. But Methuselah seems to have been his own grandfather. Didn't make it on the boat. And so it just kind of adds to some of the interesting thoughts of the account that takes place. But then notice this one as well. All of the patriarchs before this line were alive to talk to Noah face to face. And so Terah, which was Abraham's father, would have been able to have a face-to-face conversation with Noah. And so when you actually look at it, you think the accounts and even just the traditional mouth-to-mouth accounts, what we have in Scripture is inspired by God. But you would have the ability of the story of creation. It's only 2 generations away. Because all of those that could have talked to Adam, that now are able to talk to Abraham's father, is only really 2 generations of people as far as conversation is concerned. And so it's very close. And so this puts a lot of things in perspective when you think about the time. When you read through the genealogy of all the years, and when he was this old, he begat this son, and when he, and all that, you kind of get lost in all the numbers and things, and you don't realize how it actually lays out. And so I thought it's very interesting to see that, and it kind of helps put in perspective exactly the people and the times that we're talking about during this period. Now, we're beginning now what we referred to in our introductory lesson as the national period. We had the historical period, which is really that timeline, that genealogy, just giving us the history from Adam to Abraham or Abram, and that history. There's one mention during that entire time in Genesis chapter 3 and verse 15 of a promise that God is going to make, that because of sin, what happened with Adam and Eve in the garden, there's that promise that God is going to do something about it. He's going to send someone, that seed, that son of woman, that is going to crush the head of Satan. Even though Satan is going to bruise his heel, in the end, this one that is going to be sent. There's not much said about it. It's a very, very dim image, kind of a shadow of an image of, okay, God's got a plan, but nobody really knows anything about what it is. And even as we read all the way through this, through Genesis, by the time we get to chapter 12 and Abraham, there still has not been anything else said about it. 20 generations that bring us to Abraham, and there hasn't been any explanation up to this point as to why are we following this line? Why did God choose that generation of Seth and then of Shem after the flood? And why are we following this line? What is significant? If you're just reading this as a book and trying to understand the plot of the book, it's been hard to follow up to this point, other than it's important because God wants us to know about it, but he has not explained anything about it yet. And now, when we get to Abraham, we finally get another piece. It's been over 2,000 years now since Genesis 3:15, since that event in the garden. And we finally get another piece to the puzzle in Genesis chapter 12. Genesis chapter 12, beginning in verse 1, this is that promise that God made to Abraham. He says, "Now the Lord said to Abram, go forth from your country and from your relatives and from your father's house to the land which I will show you. And I will make you a great nation, and I will bless you and make your name great, so that you shall be a blessing. And I will bless those who bless you, and the one who curses you I will curse. And in you all the families of the earth will be blessed." So Abraham went forth as the Lord had spoken to him, and Lot went with him. Now Abram was 75 years old when he departed from Haran. Okay, so Abraham, at 75 years old, he receives this promise from God. And in this promise, Abraham trusts God. And he picks up his family at 75 years old. Now, we're to a point now, they're not living to be 930 years old anymore. 75 is an older age now for the age of men at this time. And so, as he's beginning to coming towards the end of his life, and he receives this promise from God. And so we see, because of this promise, it's just another hint. There's not a lot that's said other than, Abram, I'm going to use you. It's this line that we've been following all the way through up to this point. We're just now realizing, okay, there's a reason for it. There's a reason for this lineage that God was using, and Abram is going to be a key part of that because of the promise that he makes to Abraham now. So we now know the family line that God is using for some purpose. Again, there's still not much that's said. And so we keep reading and keep looking to see what's going on. But beginning here in chapter 12, about verse 10 is where I think Marcus, when last Sunday morning, ended there at about verse 10. Abram is in the Negev. I've got some maps here we'll see in just a moment. And so he's down the very south part of Canaan. And in verse 10, then we begin to see the rest of the story begin to unfold. And we're not going to read through all the text. We're going to hopefully get through about chapter 15 of Genesis today in what's going on. I'm just going to simply ask a bunch of questions. And as we go through this, be looking at it. I'll have the verse next to the question. And when the question is asked, I'll have you give me the answers to these questions as we walk through the text. And so the first thing in verse 10 is Abraham had to leave Canaan. And verse 10 tells us why. What was the purpose that verse 10 tells us that Abraham left the land of Canaan at this time? Okay, says that the famine was severe in the land. So I got to feed my family. And we're not just talking about Abraham and his few kids and his wife. We're talking about his household. He was a wealthy man. We're going to see in not very long even all of the flocks and everything. Most of this would have made this entire journey with him. And so there was a very large group of people. And so they move into something about Egypt. They learned that Egypt's not going through the famine like we are. And so they make their way to Egypt. Now in verses 11 and 12, as they entered into Egypt, what problem did Abram all of a sudden realize that he was faced with? Okay, his wife Sarai is a beautiful woman, and now he's afraid of what the Egyptians are going to do. Maybe it's because of stories that he had heard about the Egyptians and things that they did to obtain beautiful women. But whatever it is, Abram is afraid. It says that Sarai was a beautiful woman, that she was going to draw the attention of the Egyptians, and that's exactly what happened. Now in verse 13, what was Abram's solution to the problem? Yeah, we're going to lie about it. And so he goes to his wife and he says, would you just please tell them that you're my sister? Which technically is not a full lie. Why is that not totally a lie? What's that? She was his half-sister. And so it's not a total lie, and so he's probably justifying it that way. Just tell him you're my sister. Don't tell him you're my wife. I can't even imagine if I went into another country and I told Jenny, I said, let's don't tell them we're married. Let's just tell them that we're brother and sister so that I can save my skin. You know, they might go ahead and take you away and do whatever they're going to do with you, but, you know, it's going to save my skin. And that's basically the selfishness of Abram that we see here in trying to deal with this situation. And so he's willing to give his wife up. That's, yeah, just that alone. We've got a lot of newlyweds. This is one of those things, was not a smart thing for Abraham to do. So, yes, sir. You're right. You're right. You're right. We're going to see Abram do it again later on. Yeah. Yeah. And like father, like son, like you said. Isaac will do it as well. It's like, well, it worked for Dad. It didn't really work for him, though, because in verse 17 through 20, all of a sudden now, Abram has to leave Egypt. Go figure that. Why? What happened that ended up forcing Abram out of Egypt? Okay. Egypt found, the Pharaoh found out that it was a lie that was told. And what happened because the Sarai was taken by Pharaoh, what has happened to Pharaoh and his household? There's a plague. We don't know exactly what that plague was, but it was obviously enough that they wanted to get rid of this as soon as possible. And so the Pharaoh is furious with Abram for his lie. And of course, it's in that, he said, why didn't you just tell us that she was your wife? And of course, who knows? Would they have killed Abram if Pharaoh wanted her anyway? We don't know. But looking back, even Pharaoh's saying, all you had to do is tell us the truth. And right. Yep. Yeah. Sure. And it was a very common ancient belief that if something terrible happens to me in my life, that I have done something wrong and God is punishing me. And the Egyptians would have been no different. They would have been, they might not have known which God of theirs was punishing them, but that was a very common thing. And like Brent said, it's in the minds of people, even people who believe in God, that because I have done something wrong and sinned, that God could have put this plague. Job was going through a plague of his own. And that's where Job really made his stand and said, but I haven't done anything wrong. I haven't. And so there's a difference in the story there with Job, but the thinking of the people, you can see how it's very similar, how they thought at that time. I think there's still a lot of people today that still think, well, because something bad happened, they blame God for it. They say, why did God do this? And we've had several lessons on that here fairly recently. It might not have been God. It may have been Satan. It may have been me just simply making a choice and going down in a direction that was a bad way to go, and I'm dealing with the consequences. And so there's a lot of different things that could have come up from that. Yeah, Daniel? Sure. It very well could be. And it may be one of those things that when God directly speaks to Abram and says, I'm going to give you this, I'm going to promise you, Abram goes, oh, okay, I believe you, I trust in you, I have faith in you. But just the everyday, day-to-day living of here's a situation I'm faced with, now what do I do? I'm going to take it upon myself to do something, even though it's not right, to solve it on my own, instead of putting full trust in God, that God's going to take care of it. And I think that that's something as well that we can relate to, that when we see it from God's word, here's what God says, if you do this, this is what you'll receive. If you obey me, these are the blessings. These are the we go, oh, thank you, I believe you, I trust in you. But then tomorrow you're at work, and there's a temptation or there's something that happens in front of you. You've got to make a moral, godly decision on what do I do here? And how many times does man make a decision of, well, in order to keep me out of trouble, I'm going to do it this way. Instead of just saying, I'm going to trust God. I'm going to trust him that if I do it the way he would want me to do it, that everything's going to work out. And I think we all deal with those types of things every single day. Yeah, Mel? Mm-hmm.
So that I took her to be my wife.
Yep.
Now then, here is your wife. Take her and go. So for a short time, he married. He took her, Sarah as his wife.
Mm-hmm. Sounds like it. And the plague and everything that came at this time, and what we're going to see the next time that Abraham does this, could have been very well for the purpose of making sure that he took her as his wife, but so that he would not defile her sexually, that this plague comes on. I think in the next one, in the next time that this happens, we actually see that a little more clearly. But God is always doing things to make sure that my plan, and that there's no way anyone can ever argue. When Sarai becomes pregnant with Isaac, there doesn't want to be any question that maybe it was Pharaoh's son or something like that. And so God is always going to make sure that his line and his plan stays pure and true. So, very good. When we get into chapter 13 then, in chapter 13, verses 1 through 4, where did they go when they're forced out of Egypt, and they go where next? What does it say first? Okay, they go to the Negev. So that's there at the south. You see on the map, it's very southern part of Canaan. But then it continues and says, hey, he didn't stop there this time. Now he continues to where? Okay, so he moves up here between Bethel and Ai. Now he's been here before. On his way through the land from the Ur of the Chaldees, he stopped here, built an altar. This is a very familiar country for him, and so this is where they go. Now remember, we've got Abram, we have Lot, his nephew, we've got several others that are with him as well, and they're going to become part of the story here, more significantly here in just a moment. But why then we have a problem arise? In verses 5 through 9, we see an issue come up, and Abram and Lot, they divide ways. They go different ways. What was the reason behind why this happened? Yes. Yep. We have arguments that are going on. What was it, Sam? Right. It had to do with simply livestock. That their livestock, there's not enough land. Their men that were over them were fighting over water and over food, and it just became a problem. Again, this is not it's not a miraculous event that takes place here that God gets them to split and divide. He uses the natural, providential workings of men to create it does create this event. It's later on going to lead to some significant things. And so when we look at this division then, where did Lot end up going? Verses 10 and 11. He goes east to what? Okay, ultimately to Sodom. It includes Sodom to the east, but he went to the Jordan Valley, the Jordan River Valley, and so Lot moves to the Jordan River Valley. Now, even growing up, I heard this told as Abram and Lot. Let's settle this, and Abraham said, "You know what, Lot? I'm going to let you have your choice." And Lot, being the younger man and probably very selfish, he looks around and he goes, "Oh, look at the Jordan Valley. Look at all the green grass. Look at how fertile it is. That's what I'm going to take." And he leaves Abram with all the rest of Canaan that's just not as good. And I had always been told that. There's a problem. That's not in the text. It does say that Lot looked at the valley and he saw how fertile and how green it was. But we have to remember what Canaan was at this time. What is it called later on when God is bringing the Israelites back into Canaan? It's the land flowing with milk and honey. This is extremely fertile land. It's the rolling hills of Canaan and Israel. And it looks a lot different today than it did then, but that has to do with a lot of wars and a lot of fires and a lot of things, just destruction of the land that's happened over time. But Abram, he goes, it says ultimately he goes to Hebron, or he goes to Canaan, but it mentions Hebron. And so the area of Canaan, it's right after this that God tells Abram again, walk the land, everywhere you go, I'm going to give it to you. Yeah, Steve? The Dead Sea, yes, the Dead Sea was there. And we know that because of what's coming up in just a moment, because it mentions it when we get to chapter 14. And so as Lot then goes his way, and Lot is going to move down the river valley, and ultimately, what we believe, it is believed that Sodom and Gomorrah were at the southern end, down here at the southern tip of the Dead Sea. And so if that is true, then Lot eventually makes his way all the way down to the southern end of the Dead Sea. And so this division is taking place. That jumps us into chapter 14, and it just seems like a random event takes place. These events were not random. There are actually going to be some significant things that come from this event later on. But these types of things were the life in those days. When they talk about kings, there were 4 Oriental kings that make an invasion over here on Canaan. And it lists those kings, and what we're talking about Oriental, we're talking about they were from the area around where Abram originally came from. They are from over around the area around Ur of the Chaldees. That's where they're coming from. But this was very common. A king is not a king of a nation. Kings are usually the leaders of cities. And every city would have its king, its leader. And so these kings from these 4 cities, they come around and they begin to attack. And it tells us that their first visit, they fight against 5 kings, in other words, against 5 cities that are near the Salt Sea. And so somewhere around the Dead Sea, these kings come over, they invade, they conquer, they take over control. Because we read that for 2 years now, those 5 kings around the Salt Sea are paying tribute back to the other kings, and that's really why they did it. That's why kings and nations attacked and tried to conquer others for people that they would take captive, for resources, for food, and if we can control them enough, we can make them pay us taxes and tribute so that we can fund the things that we want to do back in our cities. And so, but the text tells us here in chapter 14 that 12 years later, they paid this tribute for 12 years. 12 years later, those 5 kings revolt. And because of that, those kings from the east come back. 2 years later, they return. And this time, they decide, we're going to make a statement. You're going to revolt against us. We're going to prove to you that was a bad idea. And so they come. Let me go back. And they conquer all the way down one side of the Jordan River. They go around the Dead Sea to the south side and up the west side of the Jordan River, and they conquer all of those. They just lay waste to the land and to the cities in their way. One of the things that happens here, though, is how does Abram get involved in this event? What draws Abram into this? Lot and his family. These kings, as they came through, they captured Lot and his family. That's what they do. They're going to take them back. They'll become slaves. They'll be servants in there for their people. And so they take them captive. Abram does not like that. They have now messed with his family. And so Abram gets his people together, and it's not a lot. It's just a few hundred people of his own men, and he goes after these kings. And where does it tell us that this battle took place when he finally caught up to them? Should be, what's that? Okay. See in verse 14 and 15. So it says Hobah, which is north of Damascus. Damascus is not quite on the map. Damascus is going to be right about here. So they went a little bit further north than that. But he went to Dan and caught up to them. And what that means is they caught up to them at Dan, and then they chased them and fought them all the way further north as they went. Well, they recovered Lot and his family and all of their possessions, and then the story, that event's over. It doesn't say much more about it. They start to come home. Who is it then? What important person on their way home, or maybe even actually when they got home, did they meet along the way? Melchizedek, a preacher's favorite person, because he is the easiest person to preach about and teach about and help people understand. Melchizedek, there's just a few verses here in Genesis 14 that even mention him. And so Melchizedek is described here. Well, let me ask you, who do you know Melchizedek to be by what the text tells us, what you've studied before? Okay, he's a priest and he's a king. And he also, we find a little bit later in the text, he's also a prophet. And so he is what we're going to see later on as he is the image of Christ as prophet, priest, and king. And what happens here is very significant. It says he's the king of Salem. What does Salem sound like? What is it closely related to a city that we're more familiar with? Jerusalem. And so Salem would have been that right there in that area of Jerusalem. He was already the king of Jerusalem, Salem. So that's a significant thing as well. He was a priest, it tells us, of the Most High God. And so that's where in Hebrews chapter 7, the Hebrew writer in the New Testament makes the connection. And he goes back and he draws in this image of Melchizedek as being a prophet, a priest, and a king, and how that is directly connected with Christ as prophet, priest, and king. And so it's a challenging but a very, very interesting study when we get into Hebrews chapter 7. Now, what did Melchizedek do for Abram? Verses 19 and 20. He blesses him. So here's just a man. Abram's not a king. And here is a king and a priest of God that is blessing Abram. And what reward? The king of Sodom, Abram and his men just rescued all of their people and brought them back home and all the possessions that were stolen. And the king of Sodom wants to honor Abraham and give him a reward for all that. Verses 21 through 23 talks about this. What reward does Abraham accept from the king of Sodom? He doesn't accept anything except for what my men have eaten along the way in order just to stay alive. The food that we've eaten, that's all we want. And the reason for this is because Abram doesn't want anyone to ever be able to say it's because of us that Abraham became successful. It's because what we did for Abraham that allowed him to become this massive nation of people. Abram wants to make sure that God is the only one that ever gets the glory for everything that he does. And so we'll stop there. Chapter 15 is going to be a reconfirmation of the promise to Abraham. We'll look at that again. There is a very significant statement that is made that connects to multiple things in the New Testament that we as Christians need to understand. And so we'll start with that. Read chapter 15. Actually, read 15 through 21. If you read Genesis 15 through 21, really look at it and dig into it some for Wednesday night, and we'll discuss from this point forward.